Ashleigh Merchant is a practicing attorney who was raised to believe in individual freedom and taught to work hard to protect that freedom. A firm believer in defending those accused of the most serious of crimes, Ashleigh has defended individuals on death row as well as fought for prisoners' rights and to improve prison conditions. Ashleigh has limited her practice to the defense of individuals charged with crimes. She lives in Marietta, Georgia, with her husband, John, and their 2 daughters. Ashleigh Merchant, welcome to the Global Freedom Report.
Hi, how are you?
I'm just fine. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Excellent. In your bio, you mentioned that you were raised to believe in and work hard to protect individual freedom. Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing? Who had the greatest influence on you?
Probably my father. I grew up in Florida, and my dad, he did trust in the faith, which doesn't really make you think that it would, someone would raise you to think about individuals, but he always just took such great care with his clients, and he always treated them as people, and just both my parents taught me to believe that everybody was important and everybody deserved that type of treatment.
That's terrific. Now, you also mentioned that you limit your practice to the defense of individuals charged with crimes. Does that mean you don't take civil cases, or that you don't represent corporations but only individuals, or both, or something completely different?
Just what you think it means. I only represent individuals. I like to know the person that I'm representing. It helps me. I think people are a lot more than what they're charged with in crimes, and a lot more than what the system labels them. So I try to get to know all of my clients, and I try to just represent individuals. And I've actually never represented anybody other than an individual, than a person.
How do you feel about that? I mean, these days when corporations seem to do everything and the individual has been relegated to second or even third class entity, I won't even say citizen, you got to feel good about that, you're out there doing something that it seems relatively few are willing to do, and that is taking a stand for individuals.
I love it. I love knowing who my clients are. I love knowing their families, where they came from, what type of life they've had. I like fighting for that person. I can't imagine fighting for a corporate entity that I just don't know. And frankly, I don't think I would be willing to leave my kids and my family every day to go fight for an entity that I don't know. But I can get fired up by going to represent a person. And, that's what I tell my kids every day when they're like, "Oh, Mommy, why do you have to go to work?" I say, "I'm going to fight for, Bob, or I'm going to fight for a dad whose kids want him out of jail," or something like that, And they understand that, and they love that, and they're excited about it.
Sometimes the judicial system works against the interests of the innocent. Sometimes an attorney, as an officer of the court, is prohibited from doing what might be in the best interests of her client by that very same judicial system. Have you ever encountered a conflict between your duty as an officer of the court and your responsibilities to your clients?
I've got one situation that comes to mind, and I actually think about this situation often. Had a client who was charged with some serious crimes, and he had written a letter to the victim, sort of apologizing for what had happened and saying, that there's some drugs and alcohol to play. And I had a copy of that letter, and the district attorney lost their copy, and so I had the only copy that remained. And I was 7 months pregnant at the time, and the judge tried to force me to give the letter over. And I said, "No, I'm not giving it over." And he said, "Well, you're going to jail then." And my client was like, no, you're pregnant. Just give it over. And that was the time that it really, it was really tough, because I was not going to, and I knew legally I had to give it over, but I just didn't feel like I should be compelled to do something that in the long term could hurt my client. It's hard. It's a hard struggle.
And I have to tell you that is, I know I have questions about most attorneys, because I know more than most people. I know that in corpus juris secundum, it identifies the duties of attorneys, and the first duty is to the court, not to the client. And that always seemed to be backwards, to me, from a standpoint of justice. If I have someone representing my interests, I want them to represent my interests, not the interests of the court.
Right. Yeah, it's true. It's a problem, and I think that may be one of the reasons so many lawyers shy away from representing an individual, because, if you think about legal ethics and you think about the hard questions, when you do criminal defense or you represent people, that's when you're really dealing with those difficult ethical issues. You know, who is my ultimate duty to? Is it to my client? Is it to the court? Is it to me? I mean, it's very difficult. And I think one of the reasons that I get along so well with my clients is because I do try and put them first. Their interests come first to me. And I'm fighting for them just like they were my son or my brother or, you know, my husband or my father or something like that. I always am fighting for them like they're a family.
You have become involved with a case that engenders outrage. When I go over this case, and you'll probably hear it during the interview, you know, I personally get absolutely livid with anger and with upset at the injustice of it all. You are representing Teresa Culpepper. She was arrested on the sole basis that her first name matched the first name of someone for whom a warrant had been issued. Her physical description, her home address were all different from those on the warrant, as I understand it. Yet she was reportedly incarcerated for 53 days. How did this happen, and who is to blame?
You know, it's the police that are to blame. It's the Atlanta police that are really to blame for this initially happening. And then I think it's the district attorney's office for this continuing to happen. Once she was incarcerated and once the arrest was made and the case went to the district attorney, they failed to investigate it. And what's really disturbing to me is the fact that this case went all the way to the grand jury, and she was actually indicted for this. And I know not a lot of people understand what a grand jury is, but it's a chance where the officer, and in some places the victim, come and testify under oath that a crime happened. And when you see it on TV, you always see the victim going in front of the grand jury. But that's not how it happens in real life. In real life, all it is the police officer going in front of the grand jury. And I really think that if we brought victims into the courtroom or into the case earlier, that things like this would be avoided.
Now, before we get to the grand jury, I want you to give us a little bit of a synopsis of what actually happened. First, when did you come on board? Did you come on board after she was initially arrested or after she was released, or when did you join the case?
I actually did not represent her while she was in jail. She called me as soon as she was released from jail and wanted to find out what she could do about the case because, you know, it was still on her record. She wanted to get it expunged from her record. Her car was still an impound. And, you know, her life was basically in shambles, and she wanted to find out what she could do. Just to kind of walk you through the timeline, what happened was Teresa's car had been stolen, or at least she thought it had. And so she called the police that morning, and the police came out to take a report. And the same officer was later listening to his radio and heard something go out on the radio that there was a black female named Teresa that they were looking for burning her boyfriend with hot water, basically. And that officer thought, oh, I just met a black female named Teresa. I'm going to go back and talk to her, see if maybe it's the same one. So he went back to Teresa Culpepper's house and arrested her, put her in cuffs, put her in the car, and called on the radio and said, hey, I've got this Teresa in custody. I want to come down to the hospital and have the victim do an identification. The police on the other end of the phone said, nope, just take her to jail. So he took her to jail. No identification was ever done. Even though her name didn't match, her date of birth didn't match, her description didn't match, nothing like that. Not even close. They didn't live in the same address, nothing. So he took her to jail.
Pardon me for interrupting, but so what? Do these people have even high school diplomas? I'm talking about the cops. You know, if nothing matches, what is it? Somebody just says over the phone, arrest her, and a cop just goes out and does it?
That's what happened, which is honestly it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. Because then, once you get arrested, you're caught in this cycle where nobody believes you. Because the police, the people at the jail, the district attorney, everybody is like, oh, I've heard it a million times. This wasn't you. You didn't do this. So nobody believes you. So you're now on the other side. You're now on the defensive because you're actually incarcerated. Plus, you don't have, when you're in jail, you don't have access to your ID. You don't have access to call people. It's difficult once you're in jail. And so she was really desperate, and she was really just sitting there, unable to help herself because nobody believed her.
And this happening in America, and I'm literally beside myself at the blatantness of this. God help the Johns and Janes out there. If you have somebody who committed a crime named Jane or named John, we got a white woman named Jane, we got a black man named John. Let's just pick them all up. Why not?
Right.
Be on the safe side that way. security before liberty and all that crap. Okay, so we've got, now wait, who were the cops who told them to just go ahead and arrest?
Well, what happened was that the victim had called police, and so there were some cops working on that end of the case. And then the officer who arrested Teresa that day, Teresa Culpepper, he had been working on Teresa's stolen car case. So it was two separate active cases were going on. And the cop who arrested Teresa phoned the cops who were taking the statement and were at the hospital with the victim, the burn victim. And that's the officer that said, just take her to jail.
Okay. Now,
because the original officer, the one that did the arrest, he actually, he thought to call and say, I need to do an identification. So he knew that he needed to do an identification.
But he didn't do it.
No, he didn't. No, and nobody did it.
He knew he had to do it. Why didn't he do it? Why didn't he say, wait a moment, regulations say we got to do an ID?
Right. He didn't. He did not do it. And it could have been so easy. Think about cell phones. You could have just snapped a picture with his cell phone, just texted it to the other officer, and then he could have taken her right back home.
Let's take it further. Okay, so she's been arrested and all that. How is it that it took them 53 days to figure out that she didn't belong there?
It's crazy to me because the victim, they could have taken a photo to the victim. They could have contacted the victim. And apparently the victim did get a letter from the DA's office saying, that she had a court date. And luckily her public defender that was appointed to her called the victim and had him come to court. But it took that long for someone to be appointed to represent her and for her to get an attorney because she didn't have any money to hire one. So she was at the mercy of the court. She was appointed a public defender. And as soon as that public defender took the case, it was dismissed within a day.
Oh, I'm sure once somebody started actually looking at the facts in the matter, I have no doubt. But like you said, the damage has been done. I know for a fact that the Atlanta Police Department recruits out of former prisoners. They actually look for people who've not committed bad crimes like murder or something, but maybe small-time burglary or the shoplifting or that kind of stuff. But they actually have recruited from released prisoners for minor crimes because they haven't had enough cops. So to me, it's no wonder that you have this going on. It also says something about how cheaply liberty is valued, that they make it easy to take people's liberty away rather than hard as it should be in our society. So let me ask you, what consequences will the officials guilty of imprisoning an innocent woman be forced to endure?
Well, I can tell you right now that they are doing an investigation. We are fully cooperating with their internal investigation. And those people who are doing that investigation, they'll decide what type of reprimands these officers should have internally within the police department, whether or not they keep their jobs, what sort of the consequences are to them. And then we're also in the process of gathering documents for a potential suit against the city of Atlanta. We've given them notice that we intend to pursue that, and so we've started requesting the documents, the different radio calls, all the reports from all the officers, all the materials that we need to determine exactly what type of claim needs to be made.
And I appreciate...
They'll definitely be held accountable.
No, I appreciate what you said, but when a government entity, in this case the city of Atlanta, settles a civil case, and I'm sure they'll settle it, with someone it has abused or violated, the damage award comes from public funds. In other words, the taxpayers, who are not directly responsible for the original violation. Therefore, it's not really a deterrent. What deterrence exists to ensure some other thug, cop, or rogue judge doesn't do the same thing to another innocent person?
I think the more public outcry over this case and over things like this happening, hopefully the more accountability there will be. And hopefully the next officer will think twice before doing something like this. Hopefully the next district attorney will think twice and will actually investigate the case. I'm very hopeful that some public policy changes are made and that right now no one investigates cases until way later down the road. And they need to start investigating them before arrests are made or right when an arrest is made. Actually investigate. It's like what happened to the days when they would take someone down to the station and question them and do a lineup and do all of those things and actually determine whether or not it was the actual person who committed the crime. Now it's like done an arrest, the case is closed, the police just forget about it then.
Well,
they're not doing any follow-up.
What you're saying is, and it is correct, what you're saying is that there is a presumption that the police are correct, the prosecutor is correct, and that the accused party is guilty. It is not a presumption of innocence. It is a presumption of guilt. and it permeates not just in Georgia, it permeates the United States today. What about the judge or the judges who have ruled on this, along the way? Were there any, I would assume before she was incarcerated, Ms. Culpepper's case was brought before a judge of some kind. So which judge or judges unlawfully incarcerated her, and what's done to punish him, her, or them?
They're the most isolated in the entire system. And rightfully so, because they really don't have capacity to investigate the case. They're brought, they are leaving the officers of the court, and the district attorney is bringing charges, and the judges believe that the district attorney is actually investigating them. The only judge that Ms. Culpepper saw until she was actually released was the one when she was first arrested who set a bond. And that judge set a bond of $12,000, which clearly Ms. Culpepper couldn't make. But that's the only judge she saw up until the time that...
Doesn't that judge have an obligation to ensure she has representation before he sends her away?
They do, and they actually appoint the public defender. The biggest problem I see with what happened with that judge is the fact that the officer had given a sworn statement, and it was inaccurate. He swore under oath that Teresa Culpepper was also known as Teresa Gilbert, and there was no facts for that.
Okay,
and so the judge,
my point,
but right
there were no facts there. So basically the judge is just taking the cop at his word without any evidence backing it up.
Yes, definitely. Yes, and that's the problem.
Now, isn't that complicity on the part of the judge? Hasn't the judge done something clearly wrong by just taking the cop's word? Doesn't that show bias and partiality towards the police?
At first appearance, first appearance doesn't really become an adversarial process. First appearance is really just to set the bond and for the officer to swear under oath what happened. And the judges rely on the officer's veracity and rely on the officer actually telling the truth under oath. And that's the problem, because they've got to rely on the officers. I mean,
but why?
I think the problem
why can't the
back
officer,
before that.
Why can't the officer be made to produce at least a minimal amount of evidence that what they're saying is true?
I think that's a great idea. Unfortunately, that's not how the law is right now. I think that the law should shift, and right now the presumption of innocence only really comes into play at a trial. Right now, like you said earlier, you're presumed guilty up until the trial. Everything works against you. The bond process, the investigative process, and I really do think that the system needs to be changed so that they are investigating cases earlier, and that there are those checks and balances where they're making sure, hey, we've got the right person. Hey, this really did happen. And possibly require the victims to attend the first appearance hearing so that the victims can actually make the identification, say what really happened. Because it's like a game of telephone right now. The victim calls the police, tells the police something. The police tells another police officer, supervisor something. That police officer goes in and testifies. So by the time it gets down the line, you don't know what story you have. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to victims where they say, I didn't tell the police that. And, down the line, the story has gotten so garbled that it's not accurate anymore. And I think you really need to involve the victims in the process early on.
Well, and what gets me here is you said it yourself. The officer swore under oath. Okay, so now the officer breached his oath. Okay, that's perjury, and that's got to be all kinds of other really nasty violations. So what happens to the officer for doing that?
I'm hoping that he's prosecuted for that.
But then again,
unfortunately, it's the same district attorney's office.
It's up to the district attorney who already started the action against Teresa Culpepper to go after the officer. If he decides not to prosecute, oh well, there's no deterrent to stop someone else doing the same thing.
I completely agree, and that's the problem. It's the same district attorney's office. So unless some serious changes are made, then the system is going to stay as it is. It can happen.
So, which, of course, raises the question, how do we change this? I mean, as an attorney, I was going to ask you, and at this point I think you've answered it, if you believe the existing judicial system provides justice for all, as our Pledge of Allegiance states. Clearly, it doesn't.
No, I don't think it does at all. I think justice has gone out the door in order to have an efficient process. I think if you hear most judges talk about how their office is run, they're more impressed with keeping their case count down or moving cases. You always hear the platforms where, oh, well, I moved my case really quickly. That is their form of justice, and that's not justice. Moving a case quickly through the system or, pleading a lot of cases out is not justice. And I think that people are forgetting the individual and forgetting that it's a person who's charged and it's their entire life that's at sake. And they're just moving them through the system. It's just become such a system. And efficiency shouldn't be the goal. Justice should be the goal.
And I completely agree, and I find it absolutely frustrating. Have you encountered cases of this sort with other clients? Have you, is this the first time you've encountered something so egregious as what happened to Teresa Culpepper, or have you come across this before?
This is by far the most egregious because it's the police action. I've had a number of cases where the victims misidentified my client, and my client has had to sit in jail. I actually had a horrible case several years ago where my client sat in jail for 3 years waiting for a trial. And when we went to trial, the victims came in and they had picked him out of a lineup. They came in and they said, oh, no, that's not the guy. And the fact that it took 3 years for that to happen, 3 years of his life, he's just sitting there. In that case, it's a little different because the victims had picked him out of a lineup. So the police weren't the ones that were culpable there. This case is so egregious because it could have been so easily prevented.
Yeah, and hang on, before I want to go, I just want to ask a second question about that other case. 3 years, what happened to the constitutional guarantee of a speedy trial?
It breaks my heart. It's because he was in jail and because of the backlog in the Fulton County court system, sat in jail for 3 years before.
Isn't there something in the Constitution that says you got to release him if he doesn't get a speedy trial?
It does, and there's a presumption that anything over a year violates the trial right. But the problem is, and this is just like what we've been talking about, in order to prove that, the burden shifts to the defendant. The defendant actually has to prove that he's been denied a speedy trial. And the law requires us to prove that he's somehow been prejudiced. So unless a witness has died or, someone can't come and testify or evidence is lost, we can't win a speedy trial claim like that because the law shifts the burden back to the defendant.
It is so completely...
To prove a right was violated that the Constitution gives them.
And
I can tell you the federal system has a much better system than the states do. They actually do move cases very quickly in the federal system. I really think that the state, especially the state of Georgia, should go to a system like that where the cases are mandatorily moved through a little bit faster so that people don't linger in jail. Because in large metropolitan areas like Atlanta, people sit in jail. I had a case that I won ultimately, but he sat for 5 years waiting for trial. And they did luckily find that his right to a speedy trial was violated. But 5 years?
Yeah, and that's the other thing. When something like that happens, it's 5 years out of the person's life, 3 years out of the person's life, 53 days out of the person's life, not to mention the ancillary effects of having the stigma of being a prisoner attached to you. But what about compensation? What about, okay, we have erroneously put you in jail for 3 years, 5 years, 53 days. We owe you for that. Is there anything automatic about that? Is there anything there that the government takes responsibility when that happens?
No, not at all. And there's been some talk about having bills enacted where who were in prison and wrongfully incarcerated in prison after conviction get compensated, but there's nothing in place to automatically do that. You've got to proceed on a civil suit. You've got to seek out a lawyer and proceed on a civil suit. And I've got to tell you, they make it very hard in those cases because the government is granted a blanket of immunity. And you've got to get around that. Well, and it's very hard to prove the government.
Well, the government's own courts have determined that the government is granted immunity. I question whether that was the meaning of the framers or the founders when they wrote the Declaration and the Constitution. By the way, if I may, just a correction. There's no such thing as a constitutional right, only a constitutional guarantee. I'm sure you knew that when you said that. But it's that right to liberty that, if you understand that liberty comes from a higher source than government, liberty comes from the laws of nature and nature is God, then it should not be considered cheaply. It should be considered a highly valuable trait that we each possess. Yet the government cheapens it. For any reason, snap your fingers, we'll put you in jail, no big deal. Is there anything ordinary citizens can do to help change this obviously unfair system back to something more resembling the innocent until proven guilty paradigm? Anything that ordinary, non-attorney people can do? What do you suggest?
I think the most important thing, and it may surprise you, I think the most important thing is to embrace things like jury duty. And if you're on a grand jury, society tries to avoid that like the plague. They try to avoid being on a jury, especially a grand jury. And I think that it's the one chance that the citizens have to actually take back the court system. And they need to really go into it understanding that the law is stacked against the defendant. And so they need to be cognizant of that when they go in and really embrace their opportunity to take the Constitution back in the courtroom, because it's the only time that normal citizens are allowed in the courtroom process.
Very, very good. Ashleigh Merchant, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us. Please give all of our best wishes to Teresa Culpepper. We're all pulling for her.
I will. Thank
Absolutely.
you. Thank you so much.
And by the way, folks, Ashleigh Merchant is with the Merchant Law Firm. It's www.merchantlawfirmpc.com if you want to get in touch with her. Thanks again, Ashleigh. The best of luck with the Culpepper case.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.